After the tragic mass shooting at the Sutherland, Texas church, there was an outpouring of anger against atheists because of the actions of one alleged atheist. In my opinion, one of the worst offenders of spreading anti-atheist propaganda is actually an atheist himself, named Stefan Molyneux, who stagnated on YouTube for a long time, but then exploded in popularity after he learned how fear-mongering, sensationalism, and derision is a quick and easy way to gain viewership. Stefan was one of the first to upload a video capitalizing on the Sutherland church shooting, as he does with every shooting, asking for donations, not for the victims or their families, but only for himself and his website, in both the description and in the comments section, including Amazon affiliate links. The shooting happened on the 5th of November, and Stefan started uploading videos about it, asking for money for himself on the 6th of November. In the rush to be first to report, there is often misinformation because not all of the facts are out yet, and Stefan admitted to not having all of the facts, but then proceeds to blame everything on atheism, finally offering a rather shocking and blatantly dishonest solution at the end of his video. It's clear that Stefan wanted to blame atheism before all the facts were out because there's evidence the murderer was an atheist, but there's also evidence he was a Christian. Stefan chose the evidence that best fit the story he wanted to tell. Evidence he was an atheist comes in the form of unsubstantiated anecdotes from Facebook. Evidence he was a Christian comes in the form of him being a Sunday school teacher. I don't know what the man was, but for Stefan, unverified accounts override verified behavior. I, for one, favor reserving judgment, but even if he was an atheist, as you'll soon see, he was an extreme outlier. The police, who actually have video of the shooting, say it was not religiously motivated. They say it was a domestic dispute which falls in line with the number one reason for church shootings. If you think that shooting people in a church counts as evidence for atheism, think again. According to the United States National Church Shooting Database, there are 139 church shootings during the 25 years recorded in that database from 1980 to 2005. Only 10 of those, 7.2%, were due to religious differences, which is where an atheist would fall. But that could also include Islam, other religions, other Christian denominations, or even disagreement from within the denomination itself. According to the actual numbers, militant atheists are not the ones attacking churches. The highest number of shootings in the database was from intimate partners. If you include other domestic disputes like family and personal, that accounts for a full 25.2% of church shootings. This continues to be the case in the 12 years since the database, according to this article in Christianity Today. That also falls in line with the reason the police gave for the Sutherland Springs church shooting. Stefan notes that it was the worst church shooting in U.S. history. But the previous worst church shooting was committed by Dylan Roof, a confirmed Christian who killed 9 people in a Charleston church because they were black. That's also the same reason for the very first mass killing at a church in the United States carried out by members of the KKK, also Christians, who bombed a church and killing 4 little girls. It's also worth noting that the deranged Sutherland church killer had escaped from a mental institution and had previously planned to shoot people in other places, like members of his chain of command in the Air Force, which also would not have been a religious motive. It seems that he was determined to carry out a mass shooting even before he decided to do it at a church. Stefan says that the recent rise in mass shootings has correlated with the recent rise in secularism. He says that the left is far more violent and that there's a very strong relationship between atheism and leftism. He points out that yes, there are atheists on the right, but if you point that out as a refutation, you're a fool because you're trying to use the exception to disprove the rule. I find that rather funny because he then goes on to point out the exceptions of atheist violence, namely Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, to make his case against the atheist rule, which is that atheists, including atheist world leaders, are typically very peaceful people, rating above average in intelligence and below average in criminality. So let's first address his observation that mass shootings increased as secularism increased. Stefan is, yet again, rather deceptively using an exception to disprove a rule. Mass shootings actually account for a tiny percentage of crime. Crime overall, including murder, has decreased dramatically as secularism has increased. According to the FBI, the national rate of violent crime has decreased 49% since 1991. Furthermore, mass shootings are particularly an American phenomenon. Other countries that have far higher levels of secularism than America have virtually no mass shootings, and the few that did occur were carried out by right-wing theists like Anders Breivik and Islamist terrorists. So at this point, Stefan reminds me of someone blaming video games for violence, despite violence decreasing and video game sales increasing. Also, if you look at the prison statistics from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, you'll find that very few criminals are atheists, disproportionately far fewer in regard to the overall percentage of atheists in the United States. The typical argument against this is that you can't trust inmates to report accurately. But that's a very poor argument because this information matches perfectly with other studies about atheists. There is a strong correlation between atheism and higher intelligence worldwide, and there is a strong correlation between higher intelligence and less criminality vis-a-vis. So the prison stats line up perfectly with the other data, and if you want to claim it's not accurate, then not only do you have to meet that burden of proof, but you also have to explain the glaring incongruity you would have with all the other studies about atheists, intelligence, and criminality around the world. Good luck. The National Academy of Science, boasting 500 Nobel Prizes, is over 90% atheist. In fact, the Nobel Prize itself is named after an atheist. If you look at the United States, you'll find that the least educated states are also the most religious states. This is consistent with countries around the world. This is a list of countries that have the most number of atheists. According to the top 10 most peaceful countries in the world, compiled by the Institute for Economics and Peace, the most peaceful countries are Iceland, Denmark, Austria, New Zealand, Switzerland, Finland, Canada, Japan, Australia, and the Czech Republic. As you can see, 6 of the 10 most peaceful countries on Earth also have the highest atheist populations. The major risk consultancy V-Risk Maplecroft compiled a list of the most violent countries in the world, none of which have a significant atheist population to speak of. They are Nigeria, which is half Muslim and half Christian, Colombia, 88% Christian, Libya, 97% Muslim, Pakistan, 96.4% Muslim, Somalia, 99.8% Muslim, El Salvador, 80% Christian, Venezuela, 88% Christian, Honduras 87.6% Christian, Syria 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, Iraq 85% Muslim, 15% Christian, Mexico 93% Christian, Guatemala 86.7% Christian, and Afghanistan 99% Muslim. On the left is a list of countries that have the least regard for religion, and on the right is a list of countries that have the highest regard for religion. Take a good look at those countries. Now let's say that you have to live in one of the countries in these two columns. Let's say that you're not allowed to pick the country you'd live in, but you are allowed to pick the column from which the country you'd have to live will be chosen at random. Which column would you choose? High regard for religion or low regard for religion? Curiously, despite Stefan's belief that religion is necessary for a stable society, he chooses to live in a country that's particularly left, Canada, the northernmost country of North America, where it's very irreligious and very left-wing, and as far as you can get from South America, which is very Christian and very violent. Isn't it funny that higher levels of irreligion in a country is a fairly accurate metric to use when guessing whether that country would be a good place to live? As long as we're on the subject of South America, let's remember that Venezuela's Christian supermajority did not prevent it from becoming very socialist and eventually collapsing. This is quite notable because Stefan thinks that religion acts as a bulwark against communism. In fact, it was exactly that way of thinking that created modern Islamist terrorism, which was virtually non-existent until Western right-wingers armed, funded, and supplied violent Islamist regimes, who are also very right-wing, in their proxy conflicts with communists. So not only did religion fail to prevent communism in a very religious country, and not only did religious right-wingers in the U.S. empower future terrorist regimes, thereby creating the migrant crisis, but religion is also the primary reason terrorist acts are committed today. You complain about how the left reacts to these issues, but those very issues themselves were born of the right. All of the major modern geopolitical problems that you constantly complain about originated with religious right-wingers, and your brilliant solution is more of the same shit that got us into this mess in the first place. Yet you think that one guy in Texas who may or may not have been an atheist is an indication that we need to start worrying about non-believers? Stefan says that when atheists rise to power, they persecute Christians. But again, he only uses the few examples of Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. Since then, there have been many atheist world leaders, and they have not oppressed Christians. 12 of the last 13 prime ministers of Australia were atheists. And not only were there no religious purges, but Australia ranks among the top 10 most peaceful countries in the world. The Prime Minister of Greece is an atheist. The former President of France is an atheist, and probably the new one too, yet they still support freedom of religion. The last Prime Minister of Croatia is an atheist. The former Prime Minister of New Zealand is an atheist, and the current one calls herself an agnostic, again with zero persecution of Christians, and with New Zealand also ranking in the top 10 most peaceful countries in the world. The former Prime Minister of Belgium is an atheist, never commanded the deaths of Christians. The President of the Czech Republic is an atheist, and also ranked in the top 10 most peaceful countries in the world. So, for Stefan to say that atheist world leaders persecute religious people, he has to ignore the vast majority of atheist world leaders and focus only on a few dictators from the mid-20th century who were admittedly horrific, but nowhere near your typical atheist, nor anything like your typical atheist world leader. I fully support freedom of religion. I believe so strongly that people should be allowed to peacefully practice their religion that I'd be willing to fight in a war for it. That right is so important, along with freedom of speech, press, and assembly, that it was enshrined in our very First Amendment. I, as an American atheist, have different values than Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. The common misconception is that as an American, even though I'm an atheist, my values are Christian. But freedom of religion, speech, press, and assembly are not Christian values, and in fact, they're exactly antithetical to the vast majority of Christian history, which is rife with Christian imposition and authoritarian censorship. I, as somewhat of a student of epistemology, understand that you cannot force people to believe or disbelieve, which is very different than the fake-it-till-you-make-it sentiment of many Christians. Furthermore, the First Amendment had to be invoked by the Supreme Court most often to protect religious minorities from Christians. The very point of those values is to protect the minority and to protect the unpopular opinion, to prevent the onset of tyranny. So naturally, those protections of the First Amendment are most often invoked when the Christian majority imposes itself. Not only are Christians in the West not being persecuted in any way, shape, or form, but our Constitution has had to work overtime just to keep them in check from running roughshod over everyone else, and it hasn't always succeeded. If you think Christians in the West are being persecuted, then you are the weakest of the weak, crying that little Johnny dared to touch your silver spoon. Stefan also blames leftism for labeling entire groups as evil during his long diatribe meant to demonize leftists as a group. It's quite remarkable to watch someone use group blame to criticize group blame, apparently totally oblivious to his hypocrisy. A big problem people like Stefan have, and many people in general, is that they fail to see how their own traits manifest in their enemies. When you allow your enemies to mold who you are, don't be surprised when you end up looking exactly like them. One of the Christian teachings I admire and try to adhere to comes in the form of the value of forgiveness. Because I don't want to be like my enemies. I find that forgiveness is important so that I don't have enemies in the first place. That way, I get to define myself rather than letting enemies do it for me. My criticisms of Christianity do not come from a place of hatred, but from a place of love, because I believe Christians are worthwhile people, and if I did not believe that, I would not bother with them. Stefan, like every typical political team player, only recognizes the transgressions of the other side. He actually says that the demonization of entire groups is only a leftist phenomenon. That should make it clear that Stefan never spent much time in the Bible Belt. Many such people project their immediate surroundings onto the rest of the world, sort of like a filter bubble. And for Stefan, that's Canada. So, of course, he never gets to experience Christian bigotry. He speaks as though Christians never demonize entire groups. But not only is that completely false in a contemporary sense, one need only crack open their very dogma, like the book of Romans, to find all kinds of stigmatizing propaganda against non-believers. Gay people, atheists, and religious minorities have all been demonized by many Christians to this very day, and even routinely blamed for natural disasters. Not all Christians do this, of course. I don't want to generalize, but certainly a significant number. Stefan gets all teary-eyed when he talks about a friend of his whose father got brain cancer and says that his atheist friends did virtually nothing, but that his Christian friends brought him comfort and kindness. Tears running down Stefan's face as he said that he didn't know if you'll get that from your average semi-snarly group of leftist atheists. The shameless stigmatization continues. Stefan, your anecdote is not an argument. We've all got anecdotes, Stefan, as if that means anything. I could tell you the story of my two grandfathers. My grandfather on my mother's side was a staunch atheist his entire life, a World War II veteran married to another atheist for over 50 years until death parted them. I was raised by my father in a literal garage on the south side of Chicago, but my grandfather was much better off, and he always made sure I had clothes. He was a very devoted and kind family man. He was a scientist, and he tutored me on weekends, caring very much about my education. He regularly took me to Chicago's wonderful museums. It was obvious to anyone who knew him that the well-being of his friends and family was his greatest concern at all times. He was incredibly selfless. My other grandfather was a devout Christian. He made all kinds of beautiful carvings like this chain, faith, hope, and charity, carved out of a single piece of wood. This cross hangs on my wall, the wall of a staunch atheist, because it's a part of my childhood. It's a family heirloom, and it's a reminder. That grandfather, the devout Christian, murdered my aunt and uncle with a shotgun, shot down his own daughter and her husband because he thought they had taken money from him. If my atheist grandfather had found that one of his kids took money from him, he would have said, "Well, why didn't you just tell me you needed money?" And then he would have given them more. My atheist grandfather died peacefully in his sleep in bed with his wife. And my Christian grandfather died in prison, complaining that he was getting beaten every day by the other inmates until the day he died. The difference between us, Stefan, is that I don't use my anecdote as propaganda to show that Christians are heartless murderers, while atheists are blameless saints, because in the end, my grandfathers are only two people, and there are, of course, other Christians and atheists who are very different than they. I'm simply using my anecdote to counter your anecdote, because that's the trouble with anecdotes, and that's why they're meaningless when it comes to the big picture. When you disregard your teary-eyed, emotional, driveling echo chamber porn that paints people like me with an ugly brush, and you look at the actual statistics, you'll find that the facts support me. But you know that, which is why you're very carefully selective about the information you do present, and why you rely on emotional anecdotes. You do this, probably, because you understand that human beings are more compelled by emotion than they are by logical arguments. And in this day and age, that means bank for you, because your checks are getting paid by right-wingers and Christians. After his anecdote, Stefan kicks up the emotional melodrama to critical levels. Now, normally, I would not have a problem with anyone displaying tearful emotion. I, too, literally teared up when I read about what happened in that church. The difference is that I never turn on a camera, cry into it, make a show of it for an audience, demonize an entire minority demographic, and then ask for money for myself. Stefan disgusts me. Getting through his obvious theatrics was painful. My firstborn child died in my arms. He was born prematurely and lived for 2 days. When the doctors could no longer keep his vital signs stable, they handed him to me and let me hold him as his heart stopped beating. That was after several years of trying to have a baby and 3 miscarriages. Losing a child is a pain that's indescribable. It's physically painful in your throat and your chest. The depression thereafter is crippling. Something as simple as a stranger's smile will enrage you, because how can you dare to smile when babies are dying in the world? That's the mentality I was in. And I had to isolate myself in my house, grocery shopping only in the middle of the night to avoid people. And I did that for 4 months before I could go out during the day once again, or even turn on my computer. I know what it feels like to come home with a dead baby in an urn and a hospital bill for over $100,000. So when I read about children and a baby being killed in a church, it causes the memory of those feelings to come flooding back, an echo of the physical pain. I suspect that the pain I feel when I read about such things is a little more visceral, a little more real than it is for most. And when I feel that way, the last thing on my mind is for me to turn on my camera so that people can see my tears and then ask them for money for myself. I don't see the immediate loss of other people's loved ones as a juicy business opportunity. And that doesn't make me some great person, by the way. That's just the bare minimum of decency. And you can't even manage that. You absolutely disgust me, Stefan. He uses nothing but his emotion and his imagination to label the church shooting an anti-Christian terror attack and hate crime, which is something the police directly contradict. He ties that into what he calls anti-Christian bigotry on the left, which manifests in mockery on Twitter of people who offer up their prayers after the shooting. Now, I firmly believe that it is highly inappropriate to argue about theology with grieving people. If someone's loved one dies and they're saying that they're up in heaven with the angels, you do not argue with them. That's not the time. Let's be realistic about mass shooting prayers, though. Most of the people offering up their prayers on social media are not doing it because they are grieving relatives, but because they're using the tragedy to showcase their virtue, which is especially true of politicians who were the ones receiving the brunt of prayer criticism. And much of that criticism came not just from atheists, but from Christians themselves. And I applaud those Christians for actually acting Christ-like, because even Jesus Christ himself gave such criticisms, as he told people not to seek reward by praying in public where you'll be seen, but to do it in private, in your room where only God will see. People did not attack prayer because they hate Christians, as Stefan says. They did not want prayer to be seen as some kind of solution, didn't want people who prayed to feel like they did anything useful to solve the problem, because that feeling of accomplishment might get in the way of actually accomplishing something. Stefan said, and I quote, "There are those on the left who are itching to kill Christians. And then he used communist regimes as a precedent again. While the number of deaths under communism was high, much of it came from starvation due to things like Lysenkoism. If you actually look at the data, you'll see that most Christians are killed by other Christians. When they're not being killed by Christians, they're being killed by Muslims. Roving bands of atheist terrorists simply do not exist, Stefan. Pick a country. If you want to live peacefully, I'm sorry, but you better get used to atheists being around, because that's most likely where you'll find the peace and quiet. Toward the end of the video, Stefan gets practically hysterical about his assertion that Christians are being targeted, which is absolutely ridiculous unless we're talking about the Middle East. Most of the people who are killed in the United States are Christian, not because they were targeted as Christians, but because Christians represent the vast majority in the United States. Why don't you look in your own backyard, Stefan? When was the last church shooting in your own country of Canada, that great bastion of leftism? I can't even find a single one. All I could find was a mosque shooting. Judging by your narrative, however, you'd think Christians in Canada must be living like Jews in Nazi Germany. Spare me your pathetic weakness. Finally, at the end of his painful diatribe, he decides to offer up a brilliant solution for the tsunami of violence against Christians in the United States, aka the one alleged atheist that shot people in a church. His solution is, and I shit you not, an eye for an eye. Stefan says that he believes turn the other cheek is not meant for your enemies, but rather is reserved only for friends and allies. He says Jesus' instruction that when someone asks for your shirt, you should give him your cloak too, is not meant for enemies, but for friends. He says Jesus' instruction that when someone asks you to walk a mile with them, you should walk 2 with him, is not meant for enemies, but for your friends. Among enemies, he says, the verse that should be more closely studied and peacefully studied is an eye for an eye. Let's break down this astounding stupidity step by step. Did Jesus mean for those verses to only apply to friends and not enemies? Did the same guy who said to love your enemies mean for those verses to only apply to friends? Did the same guy who said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, while he was being killed, mean for those verses to only apply to friends and not enemies? Well, let's look at the context. We've got 4 verses to consider. Turn the other cheek, give your cloak, walk 2 miles, which Stefan says are reserved for friends. And finally, eye for an eye, which Stefan says is reserved for enemies. Let's see if he's right. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. That's Matthew 5:39. Jesus' only words that allude to this person who is slapping you is, quote, evil person, and, quote, anyone. There is nothing in there that even remotely implies that he meant friends only. In fact, it looks more like the opposite being the case. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Matthew 5:40. Again, on the contrary, rather than sounding like Jesus is talking about a friend asking for your shirt, he's talking about someone, anyone, who is suing you. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Matthew 5:41. Also note that the New Living Translation says, if a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. In either case, it does not sound like this verse is meant for friends only. We're talking about someone, anyone, who is forcing you to do something. Yet Stephan changed the words to say, quote, when someone asks for your shirt. Very misleading on Stephan's part. And lastly, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. That's Jesus quoting the Old Testament. That's Matthew 5:38. Is this meant for enemies only? Those who know their Bible, and the more astute of you, will notice that this is the verse that directly precedes the verses about turning your cheek and giving your cloak, which means that Stephan gave them in reverse order, implying that those verses are not what they actually are, which is examples meant as elaboration for exactly who and what Jesus was talking about in regards to an eye for an eye, which originated in the Old Testament, not the New. The context is, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. This is not meant for friends only, Stephan, and Jesus was explicit about that. Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you. As Benjamin Stark said, nothing someone says before the word but really counts. So what is Stephan really suggesting? He says that we should peacefully explore an eye for an eye. I think the word peacefully was specifically chosen to provide plausible deniability, because the word peacefully makes no sense when we're talking about an eye for an eye in regard to mass murder. The killer was killed. That's the most you can do to him. So to start talking about an eye for an eye after the killer was killed, in the midst of the apex of the anger directed at atheists, suggests to me a mass murder in retaliation for a mass murder. Stephan has a large, adoring audience. He acts like a cult leader, and now he's talking about an eye for an eye in regard to mass murder. Ironically, the only atheist I'm aware of who you should be worried about is Stefan Molyneux.